Test? No? Test? Yes. Okay, great. How's it going?
I'm doing well.
Mic is on.
Yeah.
Okay. Test 1, 2, test. All right, we're good. Brody? I don't see presenter. I don't see this on presenter views.
No,
Yeah.
that was one of the issues we were having.
Okay.
Sorry. So sorry.
Okay. Okay, good evening, everyone. Good to see you back. At this point, this should be rather familiar to you. This is our story. Story we've been telling for the last 3 weeks. Story we'll tell again today and hopefully close with in a week from now. I'm hearing feedback here. 1 second. Okay. So the story which began with the European Enlightenment, but a story that we said we're going to focus in really post-French Revolution from a period that begins with the educational and aesthetic reform here in the 1790s and the turn of the 19th century and makes its way down to the end of the 19th century and the emergence of different denominations here in the United States. So the first story that we told was this one, the story of the emergence of the Reform movement, a story that begins with the Hamburg Temple controversy, the emergence of Abraham Geiger, that coalesces in the middle of the 19th century with a series of rabbinic conferences, and that ultimately morphs into what is known today as the Reform movement here in the United States, solidified by the Pittsburgh Platform in 1885. That was 2 weeks ago. Last week we mentioned that in opposition to these new reforms emerges a different movement, a movement that sees itself as opposed to, sees itself as the guardians of a tradition that has come under attack, one that is often associated with Moshe Sofer. I think we talked last time about whether Moshe Sofer deserves or doesn't deserve to be considered the father of Ultra-Orthodoxy. I argued ultimately that he didn't, but rather that the emergence of Ultra-Orthodoxy really belongs to be seen in the 1860s, particularly around the Psak Din of Michalovce, a document that was written and then passed around and signed by many rabbis, particularly in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and particularly on the eastern side of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And it was a series of statements of things that were now prohibited. Things like giving a drasha, giving a sermon in the languages of the world. That doing so is not only forbidden, but that walking into a synagogue that does such things is forbidden. That it is prohibited to walk into a synagogue that has the bima in the middle of the synagogue. That it is prohibited to walk into a synagogue that has a tower. That it is prohibited to dress like the clergy of other religions. It is prohibited to have a mechinsa that doesn't separate completely between the men and the women. It is prohibited to listen to a choir singing as part of the synagogue service, even if one is then forced to pray alone. It is forbidden to go into a chor shul, a choir shul. And this is considered, according to this document, akin to walking into a house of idol worship. And it is prohibited to make a chuppah in a synagogue. One can't get married in a synagogue, only under the stars. And it is prohibited to change any custom of any manner of the synagogue which was received from our fathers in our fathers' fathers. So ultimately, at the end last time, we identified these 5 elements of what emerges over the course of the 1860s into the 1870s, characteristics of what we would call today ultra-Orthodoxy. Number 1, an argument, a slippery slope argument. An argument that you can't, even if these things are technically permitted, we can't allow them because start doing this and who knows what's going to come next. Number 2, the elevation of minhag. Minhag, which is simply the custom, the way people did things, not necessarily because it was written in any text that you had to do it this way. It's simply the way people behaved. That in and of itself becomes canonized. It becomes actually a source of law that one cannot deviate if it's the way that people have always done things, whether the Shulchan Aruch says to do it or doesn't. Number 3, the idea of battle imagery, that there was a crisis, that the tradition, everything that we have had, a way of life that has lasted for thousands of years is now in existential danger. And we now need to fight, we need to gird our loins, we need to take our weapons, we need to circle the wagons and fight for the very existence of Judaism. Number 4, the notion that not doing these things, that violating these things carries penalties that go way beyond the kinds of things that we used to see in the past. And lastly, the notion that these instructions being given to the Jewish community were no longer in long responsa with all sorts of detailed legal reasoning, but this is a moment of war. In war, you can't sit around having discussions. Oh, this rabbi says this, and maybe this rabbi says that, right? And if in this situation, maybe we'll do. No, it's war. War, you just got to tell them what to do, right? The commander gives the infantrymen commands. Do this. That's it. And from these 5 elements, right, we were able to begin to see and understand parts of ultra-Orthodoxy that we see down to this day, right? Particularly when we're talking about the communities in Israel, places like Bnei Brak, Mea She'arim, Geula, right? Places where you can walk through the streets and you see these kinds of signs on the wall, signs which have these short, diskei din, statements of this is prohibited. Statements that are rallying cries, that have battle imagery, milchama l'Hashem, it's a battle for God, it's a fight for God. Statements that have very high consequences if you violate these things. Right? And we said ultimately, bringing it down to the current day, it helps us understand the current issues that we're seeing in Israel and the passion with which the ultra-Orthodox community today has taken up the fight against the draft to the IDF, which has become the newest, or today's fight for this community, right? One which carries still to this day this same type of language, the same type of rhetoric, better to die than to enlist, right? At all costs, one must resist. But if you recall at the very end last time, we asked this question. If this comes out in the 1860s, aren't the rabbis a little bit behind the times? Because after all, we've noted that in the 1840s already, there had been this series of conferences amongst the Reform rabbis who were coalescing something which began in the 18 teens, or even earlier. And by the 1840s, they had come together, they'd made a movement out of it, and they had made some pretty significant shifts to the way in which Judaism was to be practiced in their synagogues. And yet, what the rabbis in the 1860s were responding to were things that dated from the 1810s or the 1820s. They're not even responding to the more radical changes and reforms that happened in the 1840s. The rabbis in Hungary seem to be way behind the time, like decades behind. It's not what the reform movement was doing anymore in the 1860s. And we argued that ultimately there's a better way of understanding the emergence of ultra-Orthodoxy. And we pointed to this work as giving us a clue as to what is actually happening. This work of Rabbi Akiva Schlesinger, a commentary on the ethical will of the Chassam Sofer, in which much of this ideology is spelled out, as you can see on the screen in front of you. But the clue comes from this paragraph, right, when he talks about the notion that there are some who are trying to seduce you into this type of observance by saying, Tov Torah im derech eretz. How great is Torah together with derech eretz? Derech eretz technically means ways of the world. Right? How good it is. You can do them both, say the seducers. You can have Torah and you can have culture and education. You can do them both, say the seducers. Well, those seducers were not the Reform movement. There was nobody in the Reform movement, not in the 1860s and honestly not before, that had this as a slogan of Yafeh Torah im derech eretz. This was very clearly a reference to a particular individual, a man by the name of Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch. Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch used this slogan as the motto of the congregation that he built, of the schools that he built in Frankfurt in the 1850s. He didn't make it up. It comes from a Mishnah. It's an old text dating back to the year 200, in which Rabbi Gamliel, the son of Rabbi Judah the Prince, says, great is the study of Torah when combined with derech eretz. Now you should know, for the Israelis in the room, right? Derech eretz today, in a colloquial sense, means like acting properly, like midot tovot, like a mensch, right? Derech eretz. That is not the way, right? It's certainly not the way it was used in the Mishnah, and it's not the way that Rav Hirsch used it either. Right? What exactly it means in the Mishnah is a matter of debate, but certainly Rav Hirsch used it to describe worldly culture, right? Being in the world was derech eretz. So he takes this phrase from Pirkei Avot and it becomes his great slogan. And so it's not surprising that Rav Hirsch is known as the father of Neo-Orthodoxy, which is often seen as the precursor of modern orthodoxy. But the legacy of Rav Hirsch is far more complicated than that. So when I used to teach at Yeshiva University, and I'd get to this point in our course, and about to tell the story of Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch and his beginnings, and ultimately his coming to Frankfurt and its connection to the birth of modern orthodoxy, I would often phrase or frame the conversation like this. I would say to my students, if Rav Hirsch were alive today, where would he be? Or, more poignantly for the students I was teaching, if Rav Hirsch were alive today, what side of Washington Heights would he live on? Now, I imagine in this company that doesn't mean nearly as much as it did to the students I was teaching in Washington Heights. So let me explain. Here's a map of Manhattan. Right? This is Manhattan. This is Upper Manhattan. One of the, if not the, northernmost neighborhoods in Manhattan is an area called Washington Heights. Washington Heights in the 20th century was home to two very prominent Orthodox institutions. They were literally a couple of blocks away from each other. It's a little hard to see with this resolution, but you can see it's probably, 5 blocks away from one another. Now, there are huge hills in between. They were literally like two different ends of the earth. Two totally different separate communities, one centered around Yeshiva University on the east side, right, and one centered around this building of Kahal Adas Yeshurun on the west side. Disclaimer. Both of these institutions have personal meaning for me, personal connections for me. I taught in this institution. My rabbinical ordination comes from Yeshiva University. I taught undergrads this course there in Yeshiva University. Less known is that my mother's family are German Jews and deeply, deeply involved in the German Jewish community here in the United States, to the point that these steps are kind of etched into my memory. When I was, I believe, 15 years old, my great-grandfather passed away. My great-grandfather, who I knew well, was a stalwart, a highly regarded lay leader in this community. And his instructions were that the funeral procession, when going from the funeral home to the cemetery, pass by the synagogue. That's how much it meant to him. And when he did, all of the students in the school spilled out onto those steps to pay tribute to my great-grandfather as he was going to his final resting place. So these two places mean a lot to me. Our question for today is, where would Rav Hirsch be if he was alive today? Would we find him in the synagogue in the community that traces its biological roots to him, as we'll ultimately see? Or would he be on the side that sort of traces its ideological roots to him? And we'll see how that works as well. Now, caveat, this is a terrible question. Okay, a historian never asks a question like this. It is impossible to answer. We don't deal with the what ifs, with counterfactuals, right? We can only tell you what was. You could never take a historical figure and put them in a different historical context and be able to say anything of any repute about that. Okay, now that we've said that, it's a fun question, right? And it's a conversation starter. It allows us to understand or to think about this complex legacy that Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, by the way, same person, right? Same person, two very different stages of life. Who was he? What did he stand for, and what ultimately did he leave behind? So, if we are going to tell this story of Rav Hirsch, let's begin to understand why this question is even a question. So this is Yeshiva University. Yeshiva University, this is the logo at Yeshiva University. You can find this right outside the library, right on Amsterdam Avenue. And for those who can read the Hebrew, the slogan, the motto of Yeshiva University is Torah u'Mada. Torah and science, right? Torah and secular study, wisdom, which sounds a lot like Torah im Derech Eretz, right? Rav Hirsch, Torah im Derech Eretz, Torah and worldly ways. And Yeshiva University's motto is Torah and science, or Torah and wisdom. Sounds very, very similar. And in fact, Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamb, who was the president of Yeshiva University for several decades in the 20th century, he writes a book called Torah u'Mada. He explained where this phrase, that is the motto of Yeshiva University, comes from. And you can see he writes that he devotes an entire chapter in this book to Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch. Because according to him, the president of Yeshiva University, the two are inextricably linked. Because the efforts of Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch were so extensive and consequential, we accord them a separate treatment in following chapters, and instead we proceed here with a brief sketch of such ventures in Russia and Lithuania. Samson Raphael Hirsch and Torah im Derech Eretz is a critical foundation for understanding Torah u'Mada according to Rabbi Lamb. And what exactly is this Torah u'Mada? So says Rabbi Lamb the following. What are some of our contribution? This is Rabbi Lamb writing in the 20th century in New York, talking about modern orthodoxy. Yeshiva University, the flagship of modern orthodoxy. What are some of our contributions to Torah Judaism? Let us adumbrate several of the more characteristic foundations of our Weltanschauung, our way of looking at the world. some of which may appear more innovative and some of which are different only because of the emphasis we place upon them relative to other ideas and ideals. They deal with the general areas of education, moderation, and the people of Israel. The first thing that separates modern Orthodoxy from other areas of Orthodoxy or other Jewish denominations is Torah Umada, the synthesis of Torah and worldly knowledge. For the latter term, Mada, we can just as well substitute the Hirschian Derech Eretz. Says Rabbi Lam, same thing. Mada, Derech Eretz, same thing. It's about synthesizing the world of secular learning with the world of Torah. For us, last paragraph, the study of worldly wisdom is not a concession to economic necessity. We in the modern Orthodox world don't get an education so that we can get a job. We don't get an education so that we can make money, so that we can support our families. We get an education because part of being a good Jew is to be educated. Because God wants us to be educated. Because there's lots about His world that we can only understand with a secular education. Says Rabbi Lam, that's what modern Orthodoxy is about. That's what Torah Umada is about. And where did he get it from? Rav Hirsch. This comes from a self-described Haredi website, Ultra-Orthodox website. It's an old piece, I think 2005. And it comes from an Ultra-Orthodox newspaper called Yated Ne'eman. And they're writing about Torah im Derech Eretz, Rav Hirsch's approach to the world. And in it they write, the view of the Gaon and Tzaddik Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch concerning Torah im Derech Eretz was understood by the Gedolei Yisrael. It was understood by the great rabbis of the time, whose pronouncements are our authority in life to be solely a matter of hora'as sha'a. Hora'as sha'a is a description of something which is permitted under exigent circumstances at a particular time for a particular group of people because there's no other way out. It's an emergency. But the minute the emergency passes, it's no longer permitted. It's not wrong. This is Rav Baruch Ber Leibowitz. I'm not going to read for you the Hebrew that's there in front of you, but he was one of the great Lithuanian rabbis of the late 19th, early 20th century. And he writes it explicitly, that what Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch said and did when he said Torah im Derech Eretz, it was because the community was about to disappear. There was nothing he could do. He was forced into it. It was an extreme measure for extreme times. But the minute that the emergency was no longer there, the minute that the Jewish world was back on its own 2 feet, forget about it. No more secular studies, no more secular education. That's not what he meant. He wasn't trying to start a movement. He's not the father of a modern orthodoxy. No, this was somebody who was trying to save something that was deathly ill. That's the reading in the Ultra-Orthodox camp. And you should know that today, in the world of the Breuer Synagogue, which is that synagogue that I showed you a moment ago on the other side of Washington Heights, their ideology is a lot more similar to this one than the previous one. The students who are going through that school, it's known as the Breuer Shul, the Breuer School, they get a secular education, but not because they think there's objective value to studying God's world. No, they'll get the bare minimum that they need in order to get a job, right? But it seems a lot more aligned with this than with the way Rabbi Lam had described it. ArtScroll, are we familiar with ArtScroll? ArtScroll is one of the great English publishers of Orthodox texts. They do a lot of biographies as well. So this is the biography of Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, right, published by ArtScroll. And this is the blurb that describes who Rabbi Hirsch was. His philosophy of Torah im Derech Eretz is an insistence that the Torah continues to provide the guide to every aspect of life, even after the fall of the ghetto walls. What? Torah im Derech Eretz? Yafet Torah im derech eretz, how beautiful is Torah together with the study of the secular world with world. He's missing something there, right? According to the art scroll, Samson, that Torah im derech eretz means that Torah continues to be what guides us every aspect of life. It sounds a lot more like the Ultra-Orthodox world that we studied last week. So which one is it? And I'll complicate things further. If you were driving down or walking down Bennett Avenue on the west side of Washington Heights in 1950, you would have seen this sign. Now, particularly for some of you in the room, you have to get over the fact that their building campaign was for a total of $100,000, right? But note that when this Breuer's synagogue first went up, they actually referred to themselves as a modern synagogue in school. That's what they were building. That's what they said they were building. So which one is it? Was this the beginning of modern orthodoxy? Is this the legacy of Rav Hirsch? Is something modern and different? Or was it Horas Shah? Was it a blip on a radar screen to somebody who was trying to revive something that was about to die, and so he had to take extreme measures, but after that was over, everything should have gone back to the way it was before. So that's our question. If Hirsch were alive today, where would he be? What is the legacy of Rav Hirsch? The openness, the intellectualism of a world of Yeshiva University, or the world of German Orthodoxy, which today is a much more closed, right, ideologically closed community. All right. Well, to understand Rav Hirsch and his legacy, we have to understand Rav Hirsch and his upbringing. So let us jump back into the world of the 19th century. So I'm going to leave what's on the screen there just for you to look at it for a second. And you begin to give me the lecture. Tell me what is on the screen that already clues you in that Rav Hirsch is going to have something to say about this story that we've already been telling. Okay, good. Let's start with where he was born. Why is that important? Right? The whole battle, that first battle erupts in Hamburg. When? Anybody remember? 1819, right? How old is Rav Hirsch? Anybody have a 10-year-old at home? Do they know what's going on? Do they listen to the Shabbat table conversations? They do, right? So did little Samson, growing up in Hamburg, right, in 1818, 1819. But he is not just hearing what's going on in his community. He's deeply connected to what's going on in that community because Samson Raphael Hirsch's grandfather is a man by the name of Rabbi Mendel Frankfurter. Now, Rabbi Mendel Frankfurter, he goes by Rabbi, but actually he wasn't a professional rabbi. He was a businessman, but he also held communal positions. He was a very well-regarded Talmid Chacham, very well-regarded scholar. He was also born in Hamburg, but he becomes the head of the Beit Din in Altena. Anybody been to Hamburg? No? Hamburg, Germany? So if you go to Germany, if you go to Hamburg today, Altena is actually a neighborhood in Hamburg today. Back then, there were two separate cities. Actually, Altena for a while was part of Denmark, and Hamburg was kind of a free city on its own. But they're literally right over the river from each other. And the way in which the Jewish community there worked was that there were three communities that kind of were a conglomerate. And the Beit Din of Altena was actually the high Beit Din. So they actually had supervisory capacity over the Beit Dins of Hamburg and this third community, Wandsbach. Meaning, when everything blew up in Hamburg, and remember the whole thing was going back and forth with the Hamburg Beit Din, right? This petition goes to the Hamburg government, and that is the Hamburg Beit Din, right, that will say that the things in which this Hamburg temple is trying to do, these three significant changes, parts of davening said in German, references to the rebuilding of the temple being removed, and the organ played by a non-Jew, these three things, says the Hamburg Beit Din, are asur, they're prohibited. Right? And when that didn't work, they sent out and they asked the rabbis from the rest of Western and Eastern and Central Europe to join in. But this is the central point, is the Beit Din of Hamburg. Who oversees the Beit Din of Hamburg? Little Samson Raphael Hirsch's grandfather. So you can be sure that at the Shabbat table, right, at the Hirsch home, when he's 10 and 11 years old, he is hearing everything about the politics that are happening in his community. That is how Samson Raphael Hirsch grows up. We noted that last time that Moshe Sofer, right, Chassam Sofer, who was the first person to respond to this world of reforms. He's located here in Pressburg. He, though, gives rise to a generation of students after him, both some of them his children, some of them students, who will move out to the east, to the areas of the Carpathian Mountains, which border into areas of Poland up in the north. And that is really where much of what we saw last time begins to emerge, particularly with this conference in Michalovce. That is how traditional Jews in the Austro-Hungarian Empire respond to this perceived threat. But what about the traditional Jews in Hamburg, in Western Europe? How do they respond? So I think last time, I don't know if this was during the lecture or afterwards, I may have given the impression that the Hamburg temple didn't actually open. No, that's a mistake. That's not true. The Hamburg temple does open. Right? It certainly does open. We saw a picture of it, right, just a moment ago. It certainly does open. What they can't do is they don't become the official synagogue of Hamburg. And what that means is that members of the Hamburg temple get doubly taxed. Okay, and this is going to become important later on. They get doubly taxed, meaning they have to pay their dues to the community. The community funds the official synagogue of Hamburg. They want to attend and they want to support this new Israelite temple. Well, they have to pay their own dues to that synagogue in addition to what they're paying to the community. Good. What about the traditional community in Hamburg? So what do? To understand how they respond, we actually need to back up even a little bit further. If there's anybody in the room who's looking for a good thesis topic for a PhD, Rabbi Avraham Bing would make for an amazing one. There's probably no single individual more responsible for what we know of, let's call it modern orthodoxy or orthodoxy in the modern world today than Rabbi Avraham Bing. Except nobody knows who he is because he didn't leave us very much at all. Right? But I'm going to show you in a minute that he is connected to the emergence of a modern, Orthodox Judaism throughout the Western world. Of the 32 Jewish students enrolled in the University of Würzburg between 1819 and 1824, 17 of them were rabbinical students studying with Avraham Bing. Of the 67 rabbis that we know of that have PhDs in the 1840s, 9 had been his students. One of his students in particular becomes the response of the Hamburg traditional community to the reformers. Rather than fight against, they were going to lean in and say, we can do this too, and we can do it better than you. We can get a modern rabbi too, who is not going to make changes to our liturgy, right? Who is going to speak to the hearts and the minds of a post-French Enlightenment world. And in fact, when they hire Isaac Bernays, who was a student of Rav Bing, who was university educated, who was a scholar of Bible and the ancient Near East, in his contract, it says, amongst other things, that number one, he is not going to get into a fight with the new Israelite Hamburg temple. He's going to leave them alone, right? They're going to do them, we're going to do us. The other thing it says is that he's going to use a different title. Everybody notice that title? It's not rabbi. Chacham. What is that? Where does that come from? Is that familiar to anybody? Too many Ashkenazim in the room?
Wise, but
Huh? Okay, and true, but actually here it's the opposite, right? It's the Sephardic world that would use the term chacham in place of rabbi to indicate a scholar, somebody of real repute. And it had not been used in the Ashkenazic world, I don't know if ever, by a public figure, by a public rabbi. And yet in his contract, it was made clear that he was not going to go by the title of rabbi, he was going to go by the title of chacham. Why? What does this indicate? What does this signify? Scholar. We also noted last time that in the Reform world, what did they see as sort of more dignified? Right? The Spanish-Portuguese tradition, the pronunciation, the Sepharadit, as opposed to the Ashkenazis of the more Yiddish, right, pronunciation of Hebrew. The Spanish-Portuguese tradition was seen as more cultured, higher culture, more dignified than the Ashkenazi culture. And so already in his title, he's signifying he's of a different breed. He is going to bring order, dignity, respect to the rabbinate in a way that traditional Jews in Western Europe hadn't have. He's appointed in 1821 to become the rabbi of the traditional shul in Hamburg. As soon as he comes in, he takes over the schools, the Talmud Torahs. The Talmud Torahs were the schools run by the community, generally for those who couldn't pay to go to have your own teacher or to go to the cheder, you would go to the Talmud Torah. He begins to introduce secular studies for every Jew who's growing up in Hamburg. He begins to give his sermons in German and include all sorts of different texts in those sermons. So Wolf Holdenheide described Isaac Bernays as follows. My friend, what you ask is difficult indeed. In order to properly assess Bernays, one must be Bernays. My limited judgment and meager knowledge do not suffice to measure his stature. He stands above and beyond our rabbis, masters of the written and oral Torah, above and beyond our philosophers and historians of antiquity. It is said appropriately concerning him, a wise charmer. The moment he begins to discourse on Torah or wisdom, all become charmed and silent. Hearing him discuss Hebrew language and biblical exegesis, one believes he is listening to Ibn Ezra himself. Ibn Ezra, one of the great classical commentators of the Middle Ages. If the discussion is about Mishnah, Talmud, Sifra, Sifrei, it is as if he has become Maimonides incarnate. In general knowledge, he is Plato incarnate. Traditional rabbi who knows Aristotle, Plato. Regarding his character, he is pious, noble, and modest. Any community, large or small, that will have the good fortune to come under Bernays' leadership will not long remain isolated. It will become an Ir v'Eim b'Yisrael, right? A major city amongst the Jewish people, and all the nations shall flow to it. Heinrich Heine, a great German poet and writer, born a Jew, converts to Christianity, has the opportunity to go and listen to Isaac Bernays, and he describes him as follows. He says he's an ingenious man and has more spirit within him than Dr. Clay, Solomon, Auerbach I, and Auerbach II. Those were the preachers in the New Israelite temple, in the Reform temple. He's got more spirit within him than anybody who's preaching in this Reform temple, yet none of the Jews understand him. They put an intellectual up at the pulpit, one who stood for what they wanted to stand for. Whether anybody understood what he was actually talking about, who knows? Well, there was at least one person who understood, and that is little Samson Raphael Hirsch. Because after all, Chacham Isaac Bernays becomes the chief rabbi of Hamburg when? 1821. How old is Samson Raphael Hirsch? 13? This is a little bar mitzvah boy. Right? This is the rabbi presiding over his bar mitzvah. And in fact, Samson Raphael Hirsch later on in life will refer to Chacham Bernays as a major influence in his life. So yes, he's sitting at the Shabbat table with his grandfather hearing about all the trouble and all the politics created by the reformers. But the model that he's been given as to how to respond is a university-trained rabbi who quotes Aristotle and Plato, and who has been trained in the world of the ancient Near East, who gives sermons in German. That is the model that he has. Now, before we go any further, let's just take a moment here to see what else is here on the slide. So, Chacham Isaac Bernays is not the only student of Rabbi Bing that influences the young Rav Hirsch. When Rav Hirsch is ready to leave home, he goes to study in yeshiva in a city called Mannheim. At the time, the head of the yeshiva in Mannheim was also a university-trained rabbi, student of Rabbi Avraham Bing. It was this man, Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger. He studies there for only a year. That is the full extent of Rabbi Hirsch's yeshiva training, 1 year. Goes there for a year, he goes to university for 1 year. University of Bonn for a year. That's it. That's his full training. Then he's on to the rabbinate already at the age of 21. But before we go there, let's see who else is on this page. Right? This is Rabbi Nathan Marcus Adler. He becomes the chief rabbi of the British Empire and serves in that role from 1844 to 1890. This is Rabbi Abraham Joseph Rice. He is known as the first Orthodox rabbi in America. He takes a position in Baltimore. So we have the United States, we have Britain, and we have Germany, all of whom will be led in the middle of the 19th century by students of Rabbi Avraham Bing. Well worth a dissertation. Okay. One more quick note. Have you noticed anything about how these men are dressed? These are our Orthodox rabbis of Western Europe. If it doesn't jump out at you, here are 3 contemporaries from Eastern Europe at the time. And here are 3 contemporaries from Western Europe, but of a different religion. Who do they resemble more? And can you see it? What sticks out in particular? Yes, okay. Those are known as the canonicals, right? It was tied around, right? There's a collar that was tied around the neck, right? And 2 strands that would come down, right? You can see it here of Rav Hirsch. You can see it here in Rav Ettlinger. You can see it here in Chacham Bernays. Right? The hats also, although they're not wearing any hats, Jews wear hats, but this is also a Western European hat. They look a lot more like their Protestant contemporaries than they do their Eastern European Jewish contemporaries. And that tells you something about where the community already was. We're talking here in the beginnings of the 19th century. Even in the traditional world, you can see how, to the degree to which the general culture had already seeped in to this community. So, what is Rav Hirsch's story? So he studies for 1 year under Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger in Mannheim, 1 year in the University of Bonn. By 1830, he is already a pulpit rabbi. He's got a community, first in Oldenburg and then in Emden. In 1836, he will publish his first work, a work by the name of 19 Letters of Ben Uziel, followed soon after by a work called Chorev. These two works are studied down to this day. They're sort of classics of the 19th century Western European Jewish canon. So let's take a minute to look at what is inside. And what I want you to do is put on the eyes of your historian. I want you to ask yourself what these passages tell us about the community in which Rav Hirsch is writing in the 1830s. So the 19 letters is a fictional account of letters written by a young adolescent Jew to a rabbi, somebody who's searching and who's got questions. And he writes these questions to his rabbi, and Rav Hirsch responds with what the rabbi would say. So Benjamin to Naphtali, this is the young man asking the rabbi, saying as follows: "Thus I have always wondered more than a little how you, who know how to appreciate the beauties of Virgil, Tasso, and Shakespeare, and can fathom the logical edifices of Leibniz and Kant, can find pleasure in the formless, tasteless writings of the Old Testament, or in the illogical disputations of the Talmud." So stop right there, 1830s. What is he telling us about the community? The kids are disengaged. And what is he telling us about the rabbis? But that's the text of the rabbis. But the rabbi that he's talking to is, yeah, in the 1830s already. Like, when did that happen? Who said rabbis can read Shakespeare? We missed that story. Didn't happen. It just happened. Right? It was just the reality that you had these educational reforms that happened in the late 18th, early 19th century. These young folk come through those schools, they become educated. And now by the 1830s, you have rabbis who know what Shakespeare is, who are reading Shakespeare. And so now you have young people who are looking at them and saying, how do you square this? How can you possibly find pleasure in Tasso and Virgil and Shakespeare and also in Talmud? It doesn't seem to work to us. The young, the next generation. Good. As for the religious training of the young, a different section of this book, which should be the bearer of all our hopes for the future. How does it fare? How are we doing in terms of Jewish education, says Rav Hirsch in 1836. Our religious schools are like all the other institutions of learning of the present day. Our young are made thoroughly capable of contending vigorously in the struggle for a livelihood. The trades, commerce, the arts and sciences, all these are carefully inculcated and the mind developed, although even in this regard, more attention is paid to the mere training of memory than to the cultivation of habits of thought. Amazing how things haven't changed in 200 years. But what about the education of the heart, the cultivation of Judaism? Where is the school that is imbued with the Jewish spirit so that the spirit may also inspire the lives of its students? What about the rearing of human beings who will see themselves as creatures living in a divine world and endowed with powers belonging to God, which they are to dedicate to the fulfillment of God's will? Where are the young men and women who will rejoice in their mission and who will be imbued with fiery love for the name Jew, which summons them to such a way of life to fulfill divine law amidst perils, suffering, and privations, who comprehend the world, the past, the present, and themselves as cornerstones in the edifice of the future? He was a great writer. And evidently his German is far better than even the English translation. And evidently sitting and listening to him was a mesmerizing experience. He's a master. He's a master of the word. But what are we getting in terms of the understanding of where the community was? Not in a great place, right? Not in a great place. We've got young people who seem to be pretty disconnected, pretty disaffected. The second book he writes during this period, Chorev, is a work about the mitzvot. He goes through every single mitzvah and tells you the reason behind it. Not what to do, but why. Why we have this mitzvah, why it's important, why it should be meaningful to you. This is a letter that he writes to a friend of his describing this book that he's about to publish. And listen to what he said again, with the eyes of a historian. What can we glean about the community that he's living in the 1830s? Our century wants to think, and that is its greatest merit. Whatever can be rationally explained and is capable of being presented as idea and concept and can stand the test of rational thinking has nothing to fear. Our kids want to think. We live in a post-French Enlightenment world. We all think. It's what we do. But one can only analyze, test, and meditate upon things with which one is acquainted. Amongst Jews, however, nothing is less well known than Judaism itself. I dare to submit Judaism as it appears to me to intellectual analysis. I shall perhaps be blamed for it from all sides. That's what he's going to do in Chorev. But just because of that, I must not and will not be silent. Remember, he's pretty young to be putting out a pretty influential work. If I knew of even one person more capable than myself of pleading the true cause of Israel, my incapable and inexperienced pen would have rested a long time yet. As it is, however, I see an older generation in which Judaism has become an inherited mummy. A generation which shows veneration for Judaism, it is true, but a veneration without spirit. Some of that generation, therefore, see only tombstone inscriptions in Judaism, and thus despair of the eternal validity of the only thing that makes life worth living. See an older generation that does what they do because they've always done it, but there's no meaning, there's no purpose, there's no passion. And guess what? Kids are not going to take to that. On the other hand, I see a younger generation, aglow with noble enthusiasm for Judaism, or rather for Jews. These young men do not know authentic Judaism, and what they believe they know of it, they consider as empty forms without meaning. Sure, go Jews, right? We're proud of, but you ask them a question and they have no idea, right? They don't actually know anything about Judaism itself, right? One must admit, however, that this ignorance is not entirely their fault, and thus the young generation is in danger of undermining Judaism while striving for Jews. Pretty amazing. I see no one in our day capable of disclosing to the young generation the meaning behind what they wrongly consider as empty forms, of reviving the mummy and taking our young generation to a vantage point from which they can behold the shining light of Judaism. And in such conditions, should we condone a dreamy and active silence? No. It is a duty to speak out, if one is able only to hint at a root, which others might valiantly follow. I must speak simply because no one else does so. If this is the only justification for my coming forward, God will help me. How are we to understand this book of Chorev? I would consider it the first work of what we would call today Kiruv. Kiruv means trying to bring Jews back into the fold. That's what this was. Right? This was a person who saw a generation adrift. Nobody, there weren't Chabads on every campus. Right? There weren't people pulling you back in at the airport and saying, did you put on tefillin today? It didn't exist then. So Rav Hirsch says he's going to do it because nobody else is. By 1846, Rav Hirsch becomes the rabbi of Nikolsburg here in Central Europe, and actually the chief rabbi of this entire area known then as Moravia. As the rabbi in Nikolsburg, there began to encroach in this area new Reform synagogues, and Rav Hirsch will try and fight for the emancipation of Austro-Hungarian Jews. That is, he's trying to fight for the full rights of Austro-Hungarian Jews under Austro-Hungarian law. But at the same time, he will try to make some changes to the way in which Jewish practice is done, and he will become under fierce attack from both the right and the left. And so, by 1851, he leaves. Now, there's all sorts of legends as to why he would leave and who forced him to leave or why he chose to leave, because Nikolsburg was a big city. He was a chief rabbi of all of Moravia. And he leaves to come to the small Jewish community of Frankfurt. Now, I say small, not because there weren't Jews in Frankfurt, there were. But by the 1850s, the majority of Jews in Frankfurt associated with a Reform synagogue in Frankfurt. The Jews who didn't, who wanted their own synagogue, were now in the minority. Those were the traditional Jews. Now, why would they be interested in bringing a Samson Raphael Hirsch? For the very same reason that Hamburg brought Isaac Bernay's a generation before, because very few people were as talented as Rav Hirsch. Rav Hirsch was university educated. Rav Hirsch was a great orator. Rav Hirsch spoke in German, and he studied things like Shakespeare and Virgil and Tasso. If we could bring in somebody who has a foot in both worlds, right, then we have perhaps the potential to reclaim control of this community. And so he comes to what is known as a secessionist community, known as Kahal Adas Yeshurun. What do I mean by secessionist? It means that they broke away from the communal infrastructure. Just like the Hamburg temple opened its own temple that wasn't under the aegis of the community funding, well, now the script has been flipped. In Hamburg, there are Orthodox Jews who no longer want to be paying or no longer want to be bound by the community and a community infrastructure that is now under the influence of more reform-minded synagogues. And remember, this isn't just about synagogue. Right? The community controls your shochet. Right? Who's doing the shchita? Who's slaughtering doing the kosher supervision? Who is overseeing the mikvah? Who is overseeing the synagogue? All of these things come under the communal council. Well, the communal council has been now majority taken over by those who are reform-minded. You have a community that says, we don't have the resources we need. We need to create our own separate community with our own synagogues, our own schools, our own shochet, our own mikvah. We need to break away. And so Rav Hirsch leaves Nikolsburg and comes to Frankfurt. And they create this new community. Kahal is a community, Adas Yeshurun, of the nation of Yeshurun. Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch proves himself not only a great orator and thinker, but a tremendous institution builder as well. And he will build schools, and he will build synagogues. He will create a monthly journal. He will write commentaries on the Chumash, on Tehillim, on the Siddur. He is a prolific writer, thinker, orator, communal leader, and the Frankfurt community will grow over the next several decades to become one of the leading forces of Orthodox Jewish life in Western Europe. This is the synagogue that he builds in Germany. This is Rav Hirsch later on in life. Rabbi Hirsch, in his collected writings, states as follows, that Judaism never remained aloof from true civilization and progress. In almost every era, its adherents were fully abreast of contemporary learning and very often excelled their contemporaries. If in recent centuries German Jews remained more or less aloof from European civilization, the fault lay not in their religion but in the tyranny which confined them by force within the walls of their ghettos and denied them intercourse with the outside world. Jews always used to engage with the world around them. Jews always used to study all sorts of things. If they haven't done it in the past few centuries, says Rav Hirsch, it's because the outside world didn't let us in. Not because Judaism was never intending to do such things. Our aims in this community that he's building, in these schools that he's building, is to also include the conscientious promotion of education and culture. And we have clearly expressed this in the motto of our congregation. An excellent thing is Torah study combined with the ways of the world, Yafet Talmud Torah im derech eretz. So, Rav Hirsch. On the one hand, he is a man who is absolutely at home with the secular world. He is a man who will, on the other hand, spend much of his time fighting against the reform community because he's coming to a place where he has to fight that fight. He was hired to fight that fight. And in fact, over the next couple of years, he will put much of his efforts into what is known as the Austrittsgemeinde, which is the law of secession. The initial fight was a fight for tax relief. This community was double taxed, just like the reformers were back in Hamburg. Well, the Orthodox in Frankfurt did not really enjoy having to pay for their synagogue and their schools and their shochet, and also having to pay for those of the reformers. So it begins as a financial issue. But by 1871, the German states will be united under Otto von Bismarck. And Bismarck will pass a law that says that synagogues or churches, houses of worship, no longer need to belong to one centralized system. You actually can break away and create your own denominational church, which should have been great news for the Jews, right? Sort of. Because that law itself actually says that one can break away and create their own church as long as you publicly state that you are no longer a part of the original faith. So if I'm a Lutheran or I'm a Methodist and I'm going to break away from the Lutheran church, what I need to do, what this group of people need to do, says we are no longer Lutheran. We do not see ourselves as Lutheran. And therefore you can go and start a Methodist church. That works, right? And if you're a Baptist and you're Protestant and you're a Catholic, it works. But you know where it doesn't work? Because to say, I am no longer Jewish, doesn't work. There wasn't anything else, right? Yes, we want to create our own synagogue, but no, we're not ready to stand up and say we're no longer Jewish. And so that's what Rav Hirsch will fight for. And in fact, he plays a large role in actually the separation of church and state for all peoples in Germany, but in the 1870s, ultimately is successful in allowing for Jews to break away and create their own communities without having to renounce their Judaism. So, Rav Hirsch, on the one hand, university educated, very deeply enmeshed in the culture around him, absolutely is a modern rabbi, but spends much of his life fighting against the reform, right? Fighting to revive a Judaism which had been dead. So, if you ask me, where would Rav Hirsch be if he were alive today? My gut says you'd probably find him on that side of Washington Heights more than you would the Yeshiva University side. In my understanding of Rav Hirsch, this phrase, Yafeh Talmud Torah im derech eretz, how beautiful it is to study Torah, to live Torah together with the worldly pursuits, it's been terribly misunderstood, I think, in recent years. Right? A bias, right, based on the world that we live and the world that many of us were trained in. You see, there are two things in that statement. There is Torah and there is derech eretz. There is Torah and there is worldly pursuits. One could read that statement as saying, how wonderful it is to have Torah with worldly pursuits. You can do them both. Not only can you have Torah, but you can study Virgil and Shakespeare as well. That was not the world that Rav Hirsch was existing in. That was not where he came. It's not what he grew up in. The world he grew up in took for granted Shakespeare and Virgil and Aristotle and Plato. Of course you were going to have derech eretz. The whole innovation of Rav Hirsch was that you could have Torah too. That's what he was after, bringing Torah to people who already had Shakespeare, who already had derech eretz. And if you read his works with that lens, it becomes immediately obvious that's what he was doing. He was trying to bring back Torah to a world that had already accepted the world of secular education. That wasn't his innovation. His innovation was Torah. That too could be done in this community. But do not despair, because that is not the whole story. There is another man who is actually, coincidentally or not, connected to both Chacham Bernays and Rav Yaakov Ettlinger. His name is Rabbi Yisrael Hildesheimer. Rabbi Yisrael Hildesheimer will study with Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger when he becomes the Rosh Yeshiva. He moves from Mannheim to Altena. But as we've already noted, Altena is right across the river from Hamburg. So when he is a young yeshiva student learning in Altena, he will often spend Shabbat here in Hamburg and begin to listen to the sermons of Rabbi Isaac or Chacham Isaac Bernays. So he, unlike Rav Hirsch, who only studied with Rav Ettlinger for 1 year, Rav Hildesheimer will study with him for 3 years in Altona. He will get his undergraduate degree from the University of Berlin, and he will get his PhD from the University of Halle-Wittenberg. In 1851, he will be appointed the rabbi of Eisenstadt. Eisenstadt, you can see down here, is also in Central Europe. We see a pattern here, beginning in Western Europe, growing up here, educated here, and then making our way into Central Europe. And just like Rav Hirsch, it does not work out for him in Central Europe. It is not a place that is really open to the world and the worldview of a Rav Hirsch or of Yaakov Ettlinger. When he is there, right, in Hungary, he creates a yeshiva that has secular studies. This is like a high school. And he had actually the children of many of the great rabbis of the time actually sent their kids there because he was known as a world-class Talmud scholar. But he also wanted his young people to have a secular education. In 1864, the issue in the Austro-Hungarian, the same, it was known, which is their parliament, the government wants to start a state-sponsored rabbinical seminary. The state wants Jews to become more like the rest of the citizens. They want to begin to control the education of the rabbis. If you control the education of the rabbis, they think we can control the education of the people in their community. So they wanted to start a state-sponsored rabbinical seminary. And as you can imagine, the Orthodox establishment, the traditional rabbinic establishment in Austro-Hungary, fights this tooth and nail. They do not want their education of their rabbis to be under the control of the government. Rabbi Yisrael Hildesheimer has a different view. He says this is going to happen anyway. We may as well work with them so that we have a big say in what exactly they're learning. If not, it's going to be taken totally away from us. And in fact, we may be able to use this for some good. It may not be the worst idea to be training modern rabbis in a modern world. Well, that did not buy him many fans in the world of Austro-Hungary. And so he too will leave Central Europe and come back to Western Europe. This time to Berlin, not to Frankfurt. He is hired as the rabbi of the secessionist community in Berlin, known as Kahal Adas Yisrael. But far more of a Rosh Yeshiva, of an educator, than a pulpit rabbi, than a community rabbi. Rabbi Yisrael Hildesheimer, in 1869, will begin, actually, I believe later, in 1873, will start the seminary, the rabbinical seminary that he had envisioned for rabbis. Under the state control in Austro-Hungary, he's going to do it himself. He is going to create a place where young rabbis will be trained secularly and religiously, will be ready to be modern rabbis who can continue what he and Rav Hirsch had started. This comes from his inaugural address of his rabbinical seminary in Berlin. It is impossible that the desire for knowledge in one field of learning should not bridge the gap to other branches of knowledge. And since, as we say in our evening prayers, Jewish knowledge constitutes our life and the length of our days, it would be impossible that this idealism should not also throw its anchors into other waters of the intellectual ocean. Meaning, if we study one area, we need to study others. You can't compartmentalize. You can't just study Judaism and Jewish texts without studying science, without studying history. The one leads to the other. We are proud, very proud of this sanctification of God's name. It is good. This is what God wants from us, to study these things, says Rabbi Yisrael Hildesheimer. And it is most pleasing when all feel and experience completely every such occurrence of true national glory. To maintain this glory and to participate in it is the third and the last of our postulates. That is, that's what this seminary was to do. Let's just read we'll read here. Our time is focused on Talmud study and ritual practice. That's mostly what we do in this rabbinical seminary, right? So we must limit ourselves to the most urgent matters of secular pursuits. But these we regard as the most important and approach all of these areas, that is secular learning, with the same love as with all other Jewish ones, for they are all undertaken in order to sanctify the holy name. Here we see somebody advocating intentionally the study of secular learning because it's what God wants. It's part of what it means to be a Jew. It's part of what's going to make you a good and successful rabbi, not just somebody who can earn a living. Remember this question of why ultra-Orthodoxy emerged in the 1860s? Well, we said that reform really never makes its way much into Austro-Hungary. But what does make its way into Austro-Hungary? These rabbis, these Neo-Orthodox rabbis, both Rav Hirsch and Rav Israel Hildesheimer, both have positions for a considerable amount of time in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, both trying to bring a modified version of Orthodoxy to those communities, both wearing modern garb, speaking in German, bringing some order to their synagogues. Well, those things did appear, and there's no coincidence, right, that in 1865, the Psak Din of Michalovce is not responding to Reform Judaism. They're responding to all the things that Rav Hirsch and Rav Hildesheimer are going to be doing, did, and will continue to do in their synagogues in Frankfurt and in Berlin. Clearly then, the birth of Ultra-Orthodoxy was a response to early Neo-Orthodoxy, which will become Modern Orthodoxy. Let us finish the story, though, before I let you go tonight, and bring things ultimately where we'll pick up with them next time. This is really small, I'm sorry, but Rav Hirsch has a son by the name of Rabbi Dr. Solomon Breuer, son-in-law. Right? Rav Hirsch has a son-in-law named Rabbi Dr. Solomon Breuer, who will take over for him after Rav Hirsch's death as the leader of the Frankfurt Jewish community. He has a son by the name of Rabbi Dr. Joseph Breuer. He will come over to the United States. He will found Kahalat Yeshurun in Washington Heights. So clearly, right, lineage right back to Rav Hirsch. On the other side of town, Rabbi Israel Hildesheimer, who we said in his writing does seem to encapsulate that idea of Torah Umada a bit more than Rav Hirsch ever did. Well, he's the head of a rabbinical seminary, we said, in Berlin. Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman, Rav David Tzvi Hoffman, will take over after him, a man who says himself he has been influenced by Rav Hirsch and the writing of Rav Hirsch. Following his leadership, Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman will help give the mantle of the Berlin seminary over to a man by the name of Rabbi Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, known by his work, the Suride Eish. This account comes from the interwar period in Europe, in Berlin, and reads as follows. A contemporary thus described his memories of a frequent Berlin street scene during this period. In those years, we're talking about the 1930s now, one could frequently encounter three men walking along the streets of Berlin who stood out even amongst Berlin's Jewry, which was certainly not short of eminent personalities. The three men were Joseph Dov Soloveitchik, with Professor Eugene Mitvach, an Orthodox Jew and distinguished Orientalist, and with Rabbi Chaim Heller, one of the great scholars of the time, sometimes accompanied by Rabbi Dr. Yechiel Jacob Weinberg, rector of the Hildesheimer Rabbinical Seminary. Meaning, the leader of this seminary that had been started by Hildesheimer was now Rabbi Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg. He had a relationship with a young scholar who had come from Poland to Berlin to do his doctorate in the University of Berlin, and he began auditing classes in this Hildesheimer rabbinical seminary, being exposed for the first time to the idea of institutionally training young men to study both the world of Torah and the world of secular studies. So Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg and this young man, Joseph Soloveitchik, begin to have a relationship. You could find them walking down the streets of Berlin, engaged deeply in conversation. Well, it is Rabbi Dr. Joseph Soloveitchik who becomes the outstanding personality of Yeshiva University over the course of the 20th century, and best known for creating the ideology which to this day stands as the bedrock of modern Orthodoxy. So indeed, the story of these two institutions, Yeshiva University and Kahalat Yeshurin, trace their ways all the way back to the Hamburg Temple, to the story that we've been telling all along. And they do, at least in this side, give us the beginnings of what is still to this day modern Orthodoxy. However, Kahalat Yeshurin and Yeshiva University were not the only major institutions that had a major impact in Jewish life in America in the 20th century. Not the only two institutions located in uptown Manhattan that had a major impact on the life and the lives of American Jews. There was a third one, not in Washington Heights, but in Morningside Heights, right next to Columbia, known as the Jewish Theological Seminary, an institution started at this same time that will ultimately become the home of conservative Judaism. And that is the story we will tell next time. Thank you.